You're with the Retro Hour podcast, and it's time to welcome on this week's very special guest. Now, you know that Ravi and I, we need absolutely no excuse to geek out about the Amiga, our favourite system. Actually, this weekend, when the podcast lands, heading out to Mönchengladbach in Germany for the huge Amiga 40 event out there. And we thought we'd welcome on someone this week who's got a rich history, particularly in the world of Amiga, but also retro in general as well. I remember reading his online magazine back in the mid-90s, the first online magazine I ever read, called Amiga Report. We'll talk more about that. He also got to work with some of the companies that were trying to get the Amiga rights as well, including VizCorp, and you'll probably recognise him as one of the hosts of the fantastic This Week in Retro podcast. It is always part of my Saturday morning routine when I'm walking the dog or walking around the supermarket playing on my headphones. So let's welcome on this week's special guest, Jason Compton. Welcome to the show, Jason.
Thanks so much for having me on. I like the idea that you wanted to kick off the next 500 episodes with a guy who has a lot of experience talking to two UK natives on video.
Yeah, we thought you should feel very at home doing this. Yeah, so
very, very familiar way to spend my days.
Well, obviously we'll get into all the stuff I mentioned there, but one thing that we always like to do with our guests is kind of find out where your journey started. I mean, going way back to when you were a kid.
Yeah.
Do you remember like when you first got into computers then? Where did it all start for you? What was your earliest memory?
Yeah, earliest memories definitely right around 1982, which was when I first went to kindergarten. So at the time you've got Apple giving away Apple IIes to all the schools they can find. So mine had one, and they had this kid that didn't know what to do with this, and this computer they didn't know what to do with, and they put the two of us together and did some other sort of computer classes in that, which were largely Apple focused. And then when my parents decided that frankly that they were able to save up enough to get me a machine, a friend of my dad's was a Commodore guy. He actually had a souped up VIC-20, but I think he had said like, no, for him, 64 would be the way to go. And I neighbor had one. I'd seen him around, and so the 64 was what I ended up with, and that was my main platform then for 6.5 years, and that takes us into late 1991. And at that time, there is still a Commodore 64 market, but we all knew that it was not the future. It was not even really the present, and I'd had just enough money saved up. I had $900 saved up, and I was like, it's time for a new machine. And I quickly boiled it down to, what can I get for my $900? I can get a black and white Macintosh. That was straight out. Like, I'm not going to go from a color computer to a black and white machine. Not an option. I could get a 286 with a small hard drive, and I could play Wing Commander on that, and that's not bad. But then the other option was to get, a 1 meg Amiga 500 setup at the time. And I honestly had spent less time with a real Amiga than I had, I think, either a DOS machine or a Mac at that point. But everything about it just felt better. It seemed better. It seemed like it was the future. And I decided to hitch my wagon to that. And then that kind of became the thing I spent an awful lot of time thinking about in the 1990s.
What kind of software were you originally using? So were you doing anything creative on there, or were you just gaming?
So gaming for sure. I was doing, I moved all of my schoolwork over to that because, I'd had a 24-pin dot matrix printer, but I was still using Commodore 64 tools to create papers. My US pack of the A500, I think they call it the starter packs, that came with the KindWords word processor, which was entirely good enough. I was not like, I did a little bit of screwing around like with sound. I think I got one of those GVP samplers and did just a teeny bit, but it was gaming. It was, being part of the BBS scene, which, kind of then turned into online magazine work for me. And doing schoolwork and stuff like that. I was never a video guy. Was never like an audio engineer or not a graphic artist. I'm somebody who works in words, and that's, been the case and still is the case today.
Which retailers were stocking them then in America? Because, over here, we had a total different set of stores.
Yeah. At the time, I want to say that there were still some of the department stores, possibly Sears, possibly Montgomery Ward, that were stocking them. They may have just been getting out at that point. So I ended up getting it from a small computer shop. They had a few different locations in the Chicago suburbs where I grew up. And so I went with them, and if there was another place to get it for a different price or slightly different price, it wasn't particularly on the radar. I'd done a lot of business upgrades and stuff like that with this particular small store, so that just seemed the way to go. It's called Software Plus for those of you who are keeping score at home.
was wondering as well, kind of about the US Amiga scene. I mean, obviously over here in the UK, I mean, history kind of tells us that, the Amiga was much more of a success, particularly as a home computer over here in Europe. I mean, I remember pretty much all the kids at my school had Amigas between like 91 to about 94. What was it like for you in the US then? Was it similar, or were you kind of the only kid with an Amiga?
I was not the only kid that I knew that had one, but it was definitely, I mean, it was the third place machine at that time, 1991 for sure, which was okay. You didn't feel at that point too isolated. The major game stores, like Software, et cetera, they still had an Amiga section. Like I said, you'd still see some things at department stores at that point. So you knew you were in third place, and that to me was always kind of part of being an Amiga user. Was sure, we're number 3, but as long as we're in the game, let's keep fighting for it. So I think that spirit kind of hit me right away. Now that said, in kind of early mid 1992, it was becoming clear, like, oh, okay, this is not catching fire here. This is starting to drop off. So I did have a little bit of that buyer's remorse, but obviously I decided my path was through rather than out, and and kept chugging along for the basically the rest of the 90s on it, or I should say on a lot of different Amigas, because I had churned through a number in order to kind of keep up with specs and expandability and all that.
We didn't know much about the American scene, and we all had this amazing computer that came from America. We were just like, wow, this is it seemed a bit alien to us. But one thing we heard about was the fish discs.
Oh, yeah.
And these were a set of PD discs, public domain stuff, that was basically released by a guy called Fred Fish, who was like a legend in the Amiga world. You knew him, didn't you? And what are your memories of those discs?
Yeah, we crossed paths. So if there's not been a good documentary on Fred Fish, that really should change. He was a fascinating guy. And this is just me riffing from memory here. But the long and the short of it was he was a very, very early Amiga adopter. I don't remember what his background was, but I mean, he was a legit software developer. And he very quickly recognized, like, okay, this is a machine that has, XYZ development packages, C compiler and so forth, but it has basically no software. And he made it his work to port a lot of things over from the Unix style world, some other sources out there, and realized that okay, distribution is just as important as making these things available. So yeah, he started that free, well, not free, but free software, free to trade disk service. That, yes, the legendary Fish disks, all I believe he got up to 1,000. Some of the later ones were on CD, but yeah, it was just this floppy disk library. And we did meet in person at least a couple of times. Just a really, really nice, genuine guy. I know that he passed away far too young. And I mean, it's an honor that, I believe still, if you look at his Wikipedia page, there's that photo of him, me, and Dave Haney from an Amiga Atlanta event in the mid-90s, because that was a really cool event. And so those of you out there who want to dig up some untapped and undersung figures in classic computing history, Fred Fish would be a really great documentary.
Yeah, I think I heard about his discs being so early on that they were before like cover discs and
for sure,
other big PD houses. This was a really pioneering thing he was doing.
For sure. He wasn't the first one, because there was a culture of user groups in that distributing software, lots and lots of ones would do it. And even on a wide scale, like the Toronto Pet Users Group had quite a disk library, others as well. But Fred's innovation was that he wasn't just distributing the software, he was making sure that it existed in the first place. So by doing ports, creating kind of a culture and an infrastructure around it. I believe he was instrumental in making sure that the tools to master CD-ROMs on the Amiga was possible. So that kind of unlocked a lot of things in the 90s. And if I'm not mistaken, maybe double check me out this again, I'm riffing from memory, I believe he had a lot to do with the ongoing development of the IX-Emule library, which into the 90s made it possible for us to get a lot of software that just wasn't being developed on the Amiga anymore. So again, like hugely, hugely important guy, and not unknown, because the name Fred Fish, how does that Has that not grabbed your
And that
attention?
was his real name, right?
It really was his real name. The guy's name was Fred Fish, like as unlikely as it seems. And he was just this really sweet, unassuming guy, not somebody that was, slapping a tagline on so that people would buy his discs.
Yeah, absolute legend in the Amiga world.
Yeah.
Well, getting back to you, Jason, I mean, how did you get involved in journalism? I mean, we'll get into Amiga Report, but I remember reading, you did articles for the legendary CU Amiga magazine. So where did your kind of path into writing about computers come from?
So my path in, I would say that writing for money was always my number 3 aspiration in life. And so I consider myself extremely fortunate that I have in fact been able to attain my number 3 aspiration in life. Number 2 would have been to be a game designer. It turns out that's a terrible job that nobody should have. And number 1, being a game show host, but there are not many opportunities in the US for bald bespectacled. I'm wearing contacts today, but I do much better in glasses. In the UK, you get your Bruce Forsyth tradition, but we don't have that here. So number 3, being a writer. And, I got to say, it really came down to what the Amiga, and I would say kind of the broader tech culture of that time encouraged. And I would say other cultural scenes as well. It was the day of DIY. You want it, make it. Don't wait around for somebody to do it. You want a zine that covers your 5 favorite bands in town. You're gonna have to make that zine. Don't wait for somebody else to do it. And I did not start Amiga Report. I think like you, Dan, just discovered it online. It was a flat text file. It was based on a format that for the Atari ST crew out there. Hi Dave. ST format was the first text magazine of this style. There were some guys that took it and ran it with it on the Amiga side. But I discovered it, and I would download it. It was weekly. It started out, and I would download it and read it. I'm like, this is amazing. We are in the future now. It was just plain text at the time. There wasn't even the Amiga Guide hypertext yet, certainly pre-HTML. But I was like, what a cool thing. And not my very first connection with any internet whatsoever, but the first that I got from my home, there was this, again, deep dive into an obscure but important topic. Some Canadian person with more money than sense, I don't know the full story about this, but there was this Canadian that set up a multi-line CNET Amiga BBS with a 1-800 number, so toll-free. In other words, you did not pay to call it. You got 10 minutes of connect time if you could get through. And obviously those of us who knew about it were spamming, we were war dialing that number trying to get through. But if you got through, you got 10 minutes of CNET BBS with internet gateway, meaning you could email. And one of the first things that I did was I sent a letter to the editor of Amiga Report, just basically saying, this is a really cool magazine. I love reading it. And then they put it in the magazine. And I said, this is amazing. Well, the next time I can get through, I'm going to send in an article and see what happens. And then they put it in the magazine. And that ultimately, set me on the path for, I wasn't being paid to do this at the time, but seeing, okay, there's a place now that just beyond the local PBS scene or talking with my handful of friends that had Amigas or had been bullied by me into getting Amigas or, whatever, that there was now a broader platform to work from. And that was where becoming a regular contributor to Amiga Report started. Do you want me to go on and get into the print stuff now?
While we're on the subject, because I mean, it was a pretty novel concept. I mean, as you mentioned there, you kind of touched on it, that it was, how often was it at first? Was it weekly or monthly?
It was weekly. And I want to say
back then, bearing in mind, print magazines, we had to wait a month for them to print the news, and often a bit longer. Having that instant news, finding out news that had happened in the last 7 days,
right? It
was really difficult back then. So I think it was really ahead of its time.
Right. You were getting weekly. Shortly after I took it over, I moved it to biweekly because it was a lot of work. And then after that, the regularity fell off, and we can talk about that down the line. But even then, right, you get a monthly magazine, but all that stuff has been written, edited, laid out, sent to the printer, put together, mailed out. You were getting stuff that was at best, a number of weeks later than the news was. So even when things weren't, existentially interesting, as started happening when Commodore went bankrupt, there was still, the rush of great, this just came out, and we can read some analysis about it now. We can read a review about it days after it hit the shelves, not weeks or months. That was exciting. And the way that I got into the print world, definitely the collapse of Commodore and the coverage that I was trying to do of it then played an important role, because there were places that were looking for more news at a faster clip. I was able to place a story into Video Toaster User, which was a very slick, glossy magazine, aimed at the high-end video people that, were relying on Amigas. They bought a piece for me for quite a bit of money, actually, which I think was on one of the major milestones in the Commodore bankruptcy. But CU Amiga started when, I'd have to go back. I don't have my emails from that time. I think it was either Matt Bettinson or Alan Dykes. I'm not sure which one. Possibly Bettinson, possibly Dykes, I'm not sure. But they reached out to me because they knew about me from Amiga Report and said, hey, we'd like to get some of that news that you're gathering, and we'd like to have an American perspective on it. Would you do a half-page update, in each month's magazine? And I said, that sounds good, and they're like, and it pays X. And I'm like, okay, that sounds very good. And so that kind of got my foot in the door. And I want to say that was mid 1995, like right around when the first bankruptcy, Commodore to ESCOM resolved. Yeah. And from there, I kind of just kept my foot in the door and kept asking for, how about some more, how about some more, how about some more? And they kept feeding me. And I was able to stay with them through the end. I believe Amiga Computing contacted me as well a little ways in there, and I was doing a news page for them. Then the guys at CU were like, "Hey, wait a minute, you can't be doing both of these." So I turned the computing column over to somebody else. But CU was kind of the main outlet, and ended up kind of taking a lot of my Amiga energy at the time, because frankly, it paid. And I liked that. And I liked, being in print and not having to do all of the steps to get things out. And I was able to, leverage kind of that experience, just, doing, thousands of words, a month for them, into, ultimately making more of a career out of this, even after, when CU said, hey, we're going out of business. This is the last issue rather, which I think was August 98, I think, when they told me, August 98, something like that. I was able to kind of go, okay, this is probably going to be the end of paid Amiga work of any substance, but I can use that experience and keep building from there.
And it's hard to kind of explain how important Amiga magazines were. People around the world were getting covered this. They were getting all their information as well. But something like Amiga Report being online, somebody in Australia wouldn't have to wait for the delayed issue to be sent over to get that kind of information. Were you getting like lots of feedback from people all around the world, really? Because there was lots of global communities.
I really did, and I'm really grateful. There were a lot of people worldwide that wrote email, sent physical letters, that organized, because like Amiga Report itself didn't generate money; it was free, but there were a couple of places that said, hey, you can list stuff. We'll drop ship it and we'll give you a cut. There was a reader, I believe his name was Esa, from Finland. He organized a really big purchase of a bunch of stuff for his kind of cadre of Amiga users there. That was a nice amount of money for me, and really, really kind of him to do. My all-time favorite letter, and it got lost in a move somewhere, and I'm kicking myself to this day. I got a handwritten letter, possibly typed, but it was definitely a paper letter, from a dairymaid in Wales who was an Amiga fan. And she said, I have very poor, phone service out here, but a friend brings me Amiga Report on disc, every 2 weeks or whatever. And I read it and I love it. And I just that was amazing. And so I, again, kicking myself that I don't still have it, or if I do, I have no idea where that letter is. But yeah, that's the one that I always think of. It's like, well, what did this really get done? There was that dairymaid in Wales that was a little more connected to the world and her computer, thanks to Amiga Report. So I always felt good about that.
And that was awesome as well when I, not only reading Amiga Report later on, I mean, it's weird you mentioned that kind of the US columns in magazines. I remember quite a few of them had them as well. Amiga Shopper. I remember having, I think his name was R. Shams Mortier. He did a section in there as well, like stateside news. Because the world did seem a lot bigger then, before everyone was connected to the internet. And I remember a kid in the playground telling me that Commodore had gone bankrupt a couple of days after it happened. I didn't believe him. Yeah. I had to wait until the news came out in Amiga format the month after. Right. But then when I eventually found Amiga Report, I think it was on the cover disc of the cover CD of CU Amiga when they started doing CDs. I put a little folder in there with a bunch of Amiga reports in there. This was probably like 95, 96. I remember going through a few of the back issues, and you actually covered, you basically had a bit of a front seat to the Commodore bankruptcy and the buyout as well. I remember reading your auction specials. So I was interested in kind of what memories you've got of that time, because I mean, for any Amiga fan, it was difficult, but you kind of being there on the front lines and covering it. What was it like?
In retrospect, there's a lot of different ways that I should have done more of X, less of Y. What I did was a lot of bothering the same sources over and over again. Like, got anything, which was not necessarily the most effective way to do it. But it was a lot of calls, and I mean, actual calls, even people that had email, frankly, like, I don't know what your guys' experience was, but in, 94, 95, 96, 97, even, if you wanted to get somebody's attention, you called them, you called their desk, you called their home. Email was something that, especially before you had, always on and mobile and stuff like that, email could just go unseen, not because it was buried in a flood, but just because I haven't looked,
And check it once a week, yeah.
Yeah, a lot of phone calling, just asking for documentation that was, out there, the infamous Commodore Semiconductor Group liquidation material where, all I could do was, kind of laugh at the floor scrubber being up for sale and stuff like that. Like, what's our opportunity here? Well, we can at least get away with the Commodore floor scrubber. We may not be able to make more Agnes chips, but we can at least get the floor scrubber out of there. A lot of calls, a lot of people sometimes calling me, because my number wasn't hard to find. So I get just kind of random people calling me and asking me if I had any new information, and generally the answer was like no, or if I do, it'll be out soon. Like I said, easy to look back in hindsight. One of the things that I learned from that I've applied to analysis of not dissimilar things now, including but not limited to, who's going to own what they call Commodore today, is that very often it's not the people that are making the most noise that are going to be the ones that actually, end up holding the keys, because those people will actually they'll just go get the money together and do what needs to be done. Met a lot of interesting characters. Giorgio Gamelski, who was a noted record producer and music promoter and stuff like that, but he was passionate about the Amiga. So connecting with people like that from different generations and walks of life that were all just kind of asking the same. Well, what are we going to do? Are we still going to have our favorite computer? Is it still going to be this legitimate third place machine? So it was a lot of kind of trying to process that question and help address it for others.
It's interesting looking back as well, because I mean, you can actually read all your old issues of Amiga Report online. There's a website that I'll link up in the show notes. And I'm looking through now. I mean, I actually forgot that Dell were bidding on Commodore's assets. So reading that's crazy.
Yep. And that was really, that was a sign of what was coming, which was, ultimately the Gateway deal, which was ultimately one of the, because the part of the currency of the 90s in tech was, what's your patent portfolio? And, everybody just wanted to have enough of their own arsenal so that when somebody else came knocking and said, well, you're violating, 13 of ours. Well, yeah, well, you're infringing 9 of ours. All right, well, let's get together and hash this out. And you continue to see that play out. That was how things like, Digital and Compaq ended up, linking up. It was we've got this, you've got that. All right, well, we'll put them together and we'll call it even.
Yeah.
Dell's kind of under the radar interest was because they didn't need to contact the likes of me to see what Amiga Report readers thought about it. They just were going to come in and see if they could pick up a portfolio.
I'm going to try and put, for listeners who probably don't know about the buyouts and stuff, put it in context a bit. So the Amiga was still very popular in America. You probably vouch for this, that there was a huge video market of people creating, video effects and using stuff like the new tech video toaster as well, which really helped expand it into a professional market. The UK had a lot of gaming going on there. There's a lot of hardware in Germany still. And it ended up getting bought out by Escom, who were a German computer manufacturer, but they also had a history with, C64s and also the German area of Amiga. What was it like when ESCOM bought them out. And did you have much hope for that period?
I guess the self-evident answer is I must have, because at any point I could have just, done something else. Like I was not bound to keep using Amigas and keep spending all my time this way. So on some level, I was in it to win it, and had hope that something good would come out of it. Part of it was just the confusion of literally who, because it was, a regional PC brand, had no particular significance here in the US. And so trying to figure out like, well, okay, what's your game? Part of what had become clear through even just the year plus of watching what was happening as the Commodore bankruptcy dragged on was just how much the rest of the industry was changing. Remember, it was a few months after ESCOM bought out the Commodore assets that you get the massive media blitz around Windows 95. And that was very different than anything else that had happened in technology. Certainly a lot bigger than any Amiga, release you could care to name, but even, bigger than most, maybe the old 1984 Macintosh Super Bowl ad aside, much bigger. And you could feel that things are shifting. The public internet is, becoming a reality in 95. Everything that you kind of assumed being a computer user was shifting very quickly. And so the question was, okay, what are these ESCOM people doing about it? And the answer was, well, they were trying to diversify their business in an interesting way. And the answer was that didn't work either, because they collapsed under, I think the Amiga, Commodore acquisition was a minor sideline of how that shook out. But lots and lots of companies were falling by the wayside, because almost everybody was actually doomed at that time. Yeah. I would argue.
Even Apple nearly, yeah.
Well, you know what? Apple, if I may use a Dungeons and Dragons metaphor, like Apple made 10 natural 20 rolls in a row. Like by all rights, Apple should also have died. They were marked for death. They should have died. The DM said, okay, if you can roll 10 natural 20s in a row, I guess you can keep being a company. And they did it. So like the wipeout was inevitable. And I say that, to kind of, to jump to any like, what do you wish Commodore had done differently? And the answer is, they could have done a lot of things differently. Maybe would have had this or that was better, but they were doomed. Not by any great fault of their own. Just things were shifting in a way that a relatively small time company in Pennsylvania wasn't just not going to be big enough to roll with what had to happen. So going back to ESCOM, I do remember like that's the era where you start being introduced to characters like Petro Tushenko, who ultimately did a fantastic job of recognizing that what Amiga users wanted most of all at that point was just to kind of be validated. And he did a great job of that. He kind of became the Santa Claus of the Amiga. He'd give you pens. He'd tell you how important it was that he knew you and that you were an Amiga user. And, yes, we all wanted nice new machines for cheap and blah, blah, blah. But also we wanted that validation, and that was important.
I think Ravi got a can of Amiga Cola and a music CD off him, didn't you?
I got a pair of underpants.
Nice.
Yeah,
a pair of underpants. Okay,
yeah, the boxer shorts. I forgot about those.
I was wondering as well, because there was a few like weird deals with there was a company QuickPack as well, and they started producing Amiga 4000 towers, and these were kind of solely aimed at that video market, and it was seen as a bit of a route of escaping this problem they had, the video market, but also the set-top box market, which we'll talk about VisCorp in a minute, that we're going to there. So do you think Amiga could have actually gone down any of these different routes of just specialization and become a one trick pony?
Right. You mentioned, the QuickPack situation, that was, who can assemble this and kind of meet this demand out there for, the market demands more, video toaster flyer setups. How are we going to get them in people's hands? These guys can handle it. I do have one of the QuickPack A4000 towers. So, you get that out there. The A1200, issues that ESCOM managed to get out there. So there was some work that was being done. And right, you saw a lot of people trying to pivot to, well, maybe we can do embedded computing or set-top boxes or things like that. I think we did eventually find out what is a useful set-top box, and the answer was a DVR, which, and that's a very specific kind of thing. Could you build a DVR that was Amiga technology dependent in a way that would be competitively better than something else? I guess that's an interesting question. You'd be bolting on, MPEG-2 processors regardless. Does the Kickstart and Amiga OS infrastructure, I mean, we can all acknowledge now that being an Amiga user meant dealing with a lot of crashes a lot. So it's unclear to me that this thing needs to always work piece of consumer electronics. I know that there's slot machines or fruit machines, as you guys would style it, or things like that were Amiga driven. It's plausible, but at the same time, like we know, you were seeing the rise of, let's call it, prosumer, Unix through Linux and all the other offshoots, BSD and that. So you didn't need Amiga architecture. You could use this newer architecture that was designed, frankly, for faster and cheaper processors at the time, that was getting just, thousands of people working on it worldwide. It's tough to see what, even if somebody, let's just say like somebody gets hold of it in May 1994. So right after the Commodore bankruptcy, somebody says, I will give you this money to make all of this go away, and we're going to go all in on some consumer set-top device. Let's say it's a pioneering DVR. It's unclear that you can build something that's going to be durably better than what that groundswell of prosumer Unix is going to get for you. It's possible, but I think the advantages of momentum were not anywhere on the Amiga side at that point. Specialty people that understood it clearly, but so much work was being put so quickly into the Linux ecosystem and all of its kind of offshoots that it's tough to see how we don't end up in the world now where it's, Linux derived kernels and ARM that run, almost everything. And there's a few things that they don't own, but it's mostly that because just so much work went into it.
Which makes, thinking back, it's that makes total sense. I mean, obviously Linux with protected memory, you don't see a guru meditation popping up while you're watching Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. But I remember back then it was like, because of the Amiga it worked very well with native PAL and NTSC video. It felt like a lot of people did want to push it in that era where it would become a living room set-top box. And you mentioned about ESCOM, coming along and kind of not lasting very long. Right. They also went bankrupt in 1996. And then I remember it seemed like it was rumor buyout of the week. Every month in the Amiga magazines, this company's bought the Amiga. No, this company's bought the Amiga. And one that was strongly rumored, and actually I remember a few of the magazines printing that it was a done deal, but turns out it wasn't in the end, was a company called VisCorp. Now they were Visual Information Services Corporation, based in Chicago. And I know you actually got involved with VisCorp then, so tell us a bit about who VisCorp were then and what their plans were.
To talk to my involvement first, because it was a Chicago company, they had a Chicago office address, and I was just up the road, just off a commuter train line. I did what I'd been doing for the past few years, as relates to Amiga Report. I just kind of kept calling and bothering them and proverbially kicked down the door and said, hey, I'd like to come meet. And the CEO, Bill Buck, said, okay. And I met with him, and he's if you've never met him in person, I don't know if he's still around.
I've heard of him through Amiga tales.
He came in and out of the scene a few times, and I don't know how active he's been in sort of the tech entrepreneurial field in the past 15 years or so, but a very compelling individual to be in a meeting room with. Let's put it that way. And I was like, okay. I believe that this person is attempting to do a business thing that involves the Amiga. Like I'm intrigued by this. I'll buy it. And I however I did it, and I don't think they needed a ton of convincing. I said, well, hey, how about you let me be your liaison to the Amiga community? You pay me what to me was a good amount of money as a retainer. To them, I don't think it particularly mattered one way or another. And so we had that relationship for 6 or 7 months, something like that, during which time I was called on to actually do very little. The premise as I understand it, and again, this goes back to what we were talking about with the patent library being the currency in tech in the 1990s, was that Viscorp had a small portfolio of patents for set-top box infrastructure that they had acquired from, and again, was credited as a founder, I'm not sure. I believe his name was Remillard. So Remillard had a few of these patents. Investors, kind of coalesced around it. They did, if I'm remembering correctly, they did a reverse merger to become a publicly traded company where essentially you buy a company that's not really doing much, but they do have a presence on the stock exchange. So you buy them up and you transfer what you're doing over to them. So they were on one of the smaller stock exchanges here in the U.S. So they had that credibility going for them. And I think ultimately the game was, we're going to raise investor interest around being a company that has intellectual property in multimedia. They definitely were talking about, we are going to design, sell, license, set-top boxes, because they had engaged, some talent that was capable of doing that. They had hired or contracted with an ex-Commodore. His name was Al Duncan. I don't remember what his titles were at Commodore, but he was working with them on kind of the logistics of being a tech business, for lack of a better term. And he was actually somebody that when I would go down there, I would go down there every 2 weeks or so to the office and kind of just have a little status meeting. And I mostly ended up talking with Al while he was still at the organization. He left before I did. And he was he was an old Commodore hand. And I would talk to him about, some kind of like, well, the word is that Commodore you guys never did this or that. You never supported user groups. And he said, yes, we did. We did, X, Y, Z, A, B, and C. I said, well, you never did, blah, blah, blah. I said, yeah, we did. I ran this program that did this and this. So it was interesting getting his, and he wasn't like lashing out, but he was just like, no, we absolutely did that. So he was really interesting to talk to. But like I say, in terms of actually doing stuff, obviously Viscorp was interested in acquiring, what remained of Commodore property, bolstering their IP, whether that was simply to be a more attractive company for somebody else to come and buy later. Like in retrospect, I think that's very likely what the game was. Much like things like web TV clearly existed in order to be bought out by somebody like Microsoft, which was what happened. And that is a way that being an entrepreneur sometimes works. Sometimes you want to run a business. Sometimes you just want to spin something up and exit. So I think the game was, we want to buy this property for as little as we can, and bolster our perceived value, and then find somebody who, again, I think most likely will buy it from us in turn. Then ended up not happening, and like I said, they made very, very few requests of me. I said things like, "Hey, can you give me a 4,000 tower? Can you give me this money? Can you blah blah blah?" And I guess had I been sanguine about it, or had somebody sat down and just said, "Hey, Jason, let's level with you. The actual business plan here is to do X, Y, Z," maybe I would have stuck it out longer. I don't know. But I was frustrated because I really didn't have anything to do. And it was more stressful, I felt, than the money was worth. So ultimately I said, "Hey, I don't want to do this anymore." And they were like, "Okay," which made perfect sense because they had barely had any need for me in the first place.
Well, they were working on this system called the ED. And that was I read it was kind of like Commodore did with the CD-TV. It was basically an Amiga in a VCR-like box that you could expand with a keyboard and a disk drive, turn it into a full Amiga. And at the time, I remember reading these reports and thinking it was vaporware. But then I remember one actually came up on eBay, one of the prototypes a couple of years ago. So
okay.
Have you got any memories of the hardware and how kind of far they got with it?
Oh, this is going to get tricky because Before you said that there was some sort of working prototype, and I would be interested to see that, because I'm pretty sure I never saw anything actually that was technology that turned on and ran. I know that I saw some inert motherboards. I can't tell you what they were alleged to have done. So that's actually intriguing. That there was. I mean, I know that there was Carl Sassenrath. I think there may have been one or two other engineers that were working on a thing, on stuff. So do you happen to recall, like, was it 68K based, or was it its own kind of own brand?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm sure I can find it again on eBay. It was a couple of years ago, if the listing's still kind of there. I mean, yeah, they didn't show any pictures of it working, so whether it was basically an Amiga 1200 motherboard shoved into a case with a disk drive, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
It could have been that simple.
Yeah, I am not positive. I know that I never saw anything that purported to be their hardware running in their offices. I did see things that they said, oh yeah, that's our motherboard, that's our early prototype, blah blah blah. And again, I don't feel like getting that much up and running was truly their highest priority, but they did have some people that were working on some amount of stuff to make something happen, whether that was just for those meetings where you're going to say, like, and hey, how about you buy us out for $X million? That I'm less sure of, but I do know that, yeah, I never really saw that. And I know that for sure because I know that until you got to the DVR, the TiVo era, anytime I would hear the term set-top box, including and after Viscorp, I would always just think about the thing that Arnold Schwarzenegger uses in The Running Man to book their tickets to try to escape the continental U.S. So had I seen a Viscorp set-top box working, that would have supplanted Arnold in The Running Man.
It's interesting. So I remember, there was that cover on Amiga Format saying the buyout was a done deal. Viscorp had bought the Amiga. A few magazines reported that. And I was always interested in kind of how that happened, because then also you mentioned they hired Carl Sassenrath, who was one of the original Amiga developers who worked on the Amiga when it was, pre-Commodore. And I remember he very publicly quit. Yeah, in all the press as well. So do you remember kind of what the story was with them saying they actually bought the company and then it turned out not to be the case?
I honestly don't remember at this point. And if I dodged doing that, then good on me. And that may have come out of me being able to, to say, hey, I'm going to hop the train down there. Why don't you tell me what's what? In everybody's defense, we'd all been at this for a while, and really, I would put it down to, we really wanted there to be resolution more than anybody saying, oh, we'll sell some more magazines if we say that a deal's been made. I think that, the people that were hanging on in the business by then, not to say that everybody that was still working at an Amiga magazine was necessarily a true believer or whatever, but they definitely, I don't think that they were that cynical about it. I don't remember precisely how or why it would have turned into that telephone game of this is a done deal, this has happened.
It kind of had that feel of a football club trying to relive its old glories and constantly not getting there. But then Gateway came along, who actually won the buyout, and there was a strange kind of glimmer of hope when they started announcing the MCC machine. They had their own kind of Amiga division, I think, within Gateway, which was really interesting. I heard you visited the Gateway HQ as well.
Yeah, the Gateway situation. And again, that was, other than the connection that of Dell showing up last minute and putting in their conditional bid for the Commodore assets, I don't think anybody really knew that Gateway was interested. And, Gateway, and again, this was very clearly, we want to bolster our portfolio. We know that just shifting, Windows boxes, that is not a winning business strategy. We can see, that that's going to be a shrinking margin business. What can we do to differentiate, to make ourselves more valuable? If we get something else out of it, great. But clearly, how do we become more than just a company that's good at shifting boxes out of the central United States? And you guys had pointed me to, I had forgotten that I did a write-up for CU Amiga on this Amiga Summit that Jeff Schindler, who was the first general manager of that little fledgling Amiga division held. And again, it was a case of not just me, a number of people kind of knocking on his door and saying, "Hey, we want to tell you what to do with yourself." Essentially, this was our turn.
Sorry to interrupt. That's really interesting because Jim Collas, who was working with Gateway, in a previous interview, I heard they kind of got the patents, and then people were ringing them up, and as you said, knocking on the door, and kind of they realized this whole community was there alongside it and still active users.
That's true. And so Schindler's claim to fame was that he was and I apologize for anybody that he was the product lead, product manager. I don't remember the precise term, but he was the one who masterminded the Gateway Destination machine, which was it was a PC clone, and it also happened to be a big VGA enabled television. And so he was the closest thing that they had to somebody who, had what we would call, multimedia experience, and B, I think was willing to stand up and say, yes, I'll do this. I'm interested in this. Let me take this on. But what I really think is true is that, people bought a destination PC. I don't know how many sold. I don't think it was that big a seller, but they were proud of it in terms of, yes, this was something that was different. It wasn't something that Dell or HP or, name your 90s your computer brands here. It was something that those weren't doing. It was distinctive to them. But there was not a big fan community of people that had bought Gateway Destination PCs. That wasn't a thing. So when they met people like me and all the other people that were bothering them, it's like, oh, this is different. This is something that doesn't exist nearly to the same way in Gateway experience in, I would argue, kind of the PC clone business. I mean, I know there are people that have strong nostalgia and attachment to their particular PC builds, or even to a brand. But I think I think by and large we can agree that fandom that coalesced around one of those, kind of own brand architectures was different than what you tended to get around the Wintel machines. So yeah, seeing what we were saying, like, hey, you own this thing that I care about, and now I care about telling you what you need to do with it so that I'll buy more of it. Like that's something that on the one hand, marketing standpoint, you want that kind of input, but also they're sitting there going, I don't know if we can deliver on what they're asking us to do. And no, they couldn't, in part because what we wanted wasn't necessarily realistic, and it also wasn't necessarily, in their scheme. But I think it did whatever they thought they knew about, okay, there's this also ran computer platform. It hasn't really been, sold in mass numbers in the past 3 years, plus in the US, blah, 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 to get that kind of, no, wait, I want to come to South Dakota and tell you what you need to do now. I think that genuinely did surprise them. I will say that my regard for Jeff Schindler has really grown in the past 25 years or so, that I've been out of the Amiga scene, because I do genuinely think that as unprepared for the cultural realities of dealing with us as he was, I do think that he was genuinely interested in doing what he could to find a way to satisfy both what Gateway's goals were and what ours were. It's not how things ended up working out, but I do actually think that as a manager, as a leader, that was what he wanted to do. And I don't think I appreciated that enough at the time, but I do now.
And I think as well, they almost felt like a real sense of desperation in the world of the Amiga. Then we've been through so many bankruptcies and buyouts.
It was like the last hope, wasn't it?
Yeah, it really was. I mean, looking back at your old reports, in Amiga Report, you mentioned that you were getting phone calls at 4:00 in the morning from Amiga fans asking about their Amiga 1200 warranties. It was like people were just like crazy for information, and really still kind of full of lost hope then. But obviously it didn't happen with Gateway. That kind of faded away. But you go forward 25 years, as you mentioned, and it kind of feels like, Ravi and I are off to Amiga 40 in Germany this weekend. It kind of feels like the Amiga community is more reinvigorated than it has been, since those days now. So I'm interested in kind of your journey there. I mean, you stopped Amiga Report around 1998. You stepped away. Have you come back to the world of Amiga since? What do you think about it compared to back then?
I will lead by saying, if you are very happy using an Amiga today for whatever that Amiga means to you, whether it's a A500 that you've put in a tower, you're still using hardcore that style, or it's an FPGA one, or whatever. I think that's great. Nothing that I'm about to say is meant to diminish your enjoyment of your Amigas today or over the past. But I will say that, yeah, as we were getting into 1999, so at that time I graduated from college. I had briefly taken a job at a software company that I was woefully unqualified for, but it was 1998. It was the tech boom. They'd hire anybody. So they were trying to train me to be like an MS SQL developer and a Visual Basic guy. And I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing here. I don't like this, and I don't think I'm going to learn it. Also, CU Amiga had shut down, but the Chicago Tribune newspaper had started up a monthly tech magazine called Silicon Prairie. And Silicon Prairie had done a big feature article about the Amiga that they contacted me as a source. And I did what I did back then, which was I used that foot in the door to say, hey, I'm in the Chicago area. I know about technology and stuff. Why don't I write for you? And they said, okay, why don't you write for us? So I had that path. I ended up leaving that software development job, and I said, I'm going to make a go of it as a full-time freelance writer, which, to my delight, I have been able to keep up then. So I got my number 3 dream job accounted for. But it's 1999, and it's getting more difficult to access general purpose websites that I need to look at in order to do my work. And I don't have the date burned into my brain, but at some point in 99, I said, I need to start using a Windows machine as my daily driver. I just can't keep working on my 4000 tower and hoping I can get through where I need to go. And yeah, there's another computer in the house. It's a Pentium 200 or whatever, but it is dumb that I'm going over to use somebody else's computer to access websites and then coming over to my Amiga to write this. I'm not doing this anymore. And so powered it down and became a Windows user for a while. And that kind of ended my story as a regular Amiga user. What I have found for me personally, although I have gone back and I'll play things through like WinUAE or things like that, but what I found every once in a while when I have tried to like pull out an old machine is that the things that used to be second nature are both extraordinarily confusing and very frustrating. So like back in the day, when I had my souped up machine with the CyberGrafx card and whatever, and I hooked it up to a new monitor and the new monitor wouldn't sync to the right settings, I knew how to interrupt early startup, get in the editor, change the frequencies, go in and get display. I no longer know how to do that. And it makes me very unhappy and sad and frustrated when I've tried to do it. So I don't try to do it anymore. And a lot of the other kind of quirks of navigating the Amiga architecture, which I dealt with at the time, because at the time I was saying, I know this is a third platform. It may never be more than a third platform, but by God, I'm gonna will this third platform to continue being a legitimate third platform. At that point, for me at least, I was saying, look, I can see that this gateway thing is not going anywhere. That's a direction I'm interested in. I know there are these other fan groups that are pushing for things. This does not seem to be something that I'm personally investing in, buying into. So that the fighting with the, and every architecture has quirks, but fighting with the quirks that come with the Amiga were no longer fun or rewarding for me when the project was not, we're gonna make this third thing happen. So all of the what is the OS? Who runs the OS? What is the OS based on? Is it like this? Is it PowerPC? Is it whatever? All that is not my problem to deal with. And I feel very happy about that. And what I'll say is, in addition to that, like the Commodore 64, which was my first platform, that never stopped being fun. And I think that part of that came out of, there was nothing to prove being a Commodore 64 user. Like, no, it wasn't the machine that everybody wanted to use. If you needed 80-column, professional software, you'd use one of those. But if you had a 64 and you were a 64 user, you had a good computer. And if, like me, like I've always had a Commodore 64, at least one set up in the home that I live with, tiny exceptions when there literally wasn't room. But from 1986 onward, I've always had at least one 64 setup ready to go. And it's never stopped being fun. And there's never been any pressure on me to make it fun or make it something other than it's not. And the Amiga, for me, became almost consumingly about, we need to make this happen. We need to force this across the next finish line, the next finish line, the next finish line. And those became increasingly difficult to do. And so it's been difficult for me to look at it as a thing that I would do for fun. That said, I am interested in the prospect of that full-size A1200 that RGL is putting out. I may actually get into that because their carousel system gets me I just want to do this, please, and not fight with user startup, if you don't mind. And I think that might be a way to kind of lure somebody like me who lost the fun part of it and hasn't been able to rediscover that because of the both cultural and technological hurdles that stand in my way. So I am looking forward to that as a prospect. But for me, apart from occasionally glancing in and going like, wait a minute, that guy's back? Wait a minute, they're still talking about doing that? Or as I lamented, and I think this was how Ravi and I got talking pretty early on, in one of the very first episodes of This Week in Retro I was on, I ended up doing a bunch of coverage of like all these different Amiga OS offshoots. And I'm like, I can't believe this. Like, of all the things that I'm having to train myself up on, I have to care about this again. My frustration was not, it was not a put on. I really couldn't believe that was what I'd ended up doing. So
I love your point there. I just think, when you say there was that point that you remember specifically, that kind of date where you gave up the Amiga as a serious machine. I think we all had that. Dan had that. I remember seeing Unreal for the first time and going, right, I'm going to go buy a PC, use this as my kind of serious machine as well. But then now you find yourself talking about Amigas as a hobby, as a fun thing. I think
that's the difference. We're not expecting it to beat the Mac and Windows anymore. I think, you can see it as a fun retro system.
To give up that fight, and
I understand that for a lot of people that is now the case. So if you're happy in whether it's you guys have to help me out. If it's the 3.2 thread or the 3.9 thread, or if that's what you're digging, like I am not here to tell you that you're wrong, you're bad, stop doing that, it's bad for you. I'm not. But for me, that is a fun pastime. Those days are gone.
We did mention This Week in Retro, which, of course, you are one of the hosts of. Fantastic podcast. I'm sure a lot of our audience already listen every week that you do with the awesome Chris and Dave. So tell us a bit about how you got involved with that then, and how you're finding being a podcaster.
Yeah. It's actually an interesting parallel to doing Amiga Report, because like I said, Amiga Report was not my idea. I did not start it. I put a lot of time and energy into it once I got involved. And to the extent that I'm synonymous with it, unfairly, because there were two other editors and it was based on ST format and so forth. I'm grateful for that, but there's other history out there. So close to 2 years ago, somebody on a Facebook group dedicated to text adventures posted, and he said, "Hey, I'm thinking of starting a podcast for text adventures. It'll be like this. Who's interested in doing this with me?" And I raised my hand and I said, well, okay, I'm interested in this. So that became the Retro Adventurers podcast, which has been around for about 1.5 years. So again, I got involved with something that was not my idea, but it fit I have thoughts about this. I would like to share and express with people. Let's go do this. And I did end up kind of being we'll call myself the lead producer of the Retro Adventurers, because it turns out that it was more work than Ben felt like doing. So he's still involved with the podcast, but he's not driving it on an episode by episode basis. That's me now. And shortly after we launched, we got a mention on This Week in Retro, and people came to the Facebook page and said, "Oh, I heard about this through This Week in Retro," and I so I dug that up. And I was somewhat aware of This Week in Retro, mostly from some Twitter interactions with co-founder Neil. But I wasn't a regular listener to it. But, they threw us a mention. And so I'm like, okay, this seems like a thing to follow. And, was ultimately involved in some discussions back and forth with Dave. And as things were starting to change over there. They were starting to think about, is it time to bring a third host back into the mix? The show had fluctuated a few times between a 2-host and a 3-host format. So we had started talking about that as I came on to do a guest appearance. At the same time, then Neil started to think about life after This Week in Retro. So that became a shift as well. And all the while, again, I'm sitting here saying, I'm interested in this format. This is an expression of things that I like to do. I like to write articles about classic retro tech. I'm sharing them in a video and podcast format. That seems great to me too. So by kind of staying on it and saying, well, I'm here. I'm interested in doing this, even at 7 a.m. Let's do this if you want to do it. So yeah, they brought me in on a full-time basis back in May, I believe. So it's been the better part of half a year at this point. And so again, like if I have a closing message, I think is that yes, as much as the 90s were a time of that DIY spirit, just go out and do it. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that you have to be the person that invents the format all on your own and creates a brand all on your own. Like you can work with other people. You can collaborate on something that already exists. Say, hey, I have a way to add to this or bolster it, or take on some of the load that you guys may be struggling under. So it's not dissimilar, the Amiga Report Retro Adventures and This Week in Retro story, me seeing a thing and going, well, I'd like to take part in this, and I'm saying, all right.
It kind of reminds me of, when I read your columns in CU Amiga. I think when I listened to This Week in Retro, the fact that you have that different perspective, being US based as well, I think that's really interesting. So it gives a nice broad kind of coverage of the retro scene and opinions as well. So obviously I'll link it up in the show notes. People haven't checked it out. Fantastic podcast. I listen every Saturday morning. So keep up the good work on that. And Jason, it's been great to hear your memories of working on Amiga Report as well. I am excited to hear that you might be picking up a full-size A1200. Part of me kind of hopes that maybe you'll bring back Amiga Report. I know you probably won't, but people do say, I read it on forums once, that you never really leave the Amiga, it always drags you back.
I was contacted a few years ago by somebody who said, all of the problems in the Amiga are solved now. You should really do another issue of Amiga Report and explain all that. And I said, really, has this all been resolved? And the answer seems like, no, it hasn't. So it has been discussed. I'm not completely closed to it, but yeah, it was fun reliving that and how that came to be. And the Amiga, that the 90s that I spent with the Amiga, almost 10 years of really focused effort. I mean, that absolutely paved the way for the career I have now. If I'd got that 286, might I have become a tech writer anyway? It's possible. But without the inherent struggle that being an Amiga user, first in a market where it was just sort of a meh, machine, and then in a market where people were like, no, seriously, I need answers. I want to read what you're saying in the hopes that there might be some news. Not only does that give you a built-in audience, but it ups your game. Not to say that I was by any means a perfect or even particularly skilled reporter and journalist at that time, but at least I knew, hey, there are people out there that need me to not completely fumble this. So it created stakes.
Yeah, and as I read about that, I mean, yeah, thank you for the work you did put in on that, because it was definitely a lifeline. As we said, those were troubled times for the Amiga. So great to hear some of your memories, Jason. Keep up the good work on This Week in Retro as well.
Thank you.
And thanks so much for coming on and being our guest this week.
Thank you. And if you know that Welsh dairymaid, please get me in touch with her. I'd like to thank her once again.
She might be listening. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you.